Even though they probably constitute a minority, there are a number of philosophers who argue for strong determinism, that is, we do not have free will, of the variety which allows for moral responsibility. Interestingly, because most take the reality of free will as a given, arguments in favor of it are often neglected, while some opponents have put forth cogent claims which need to be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. Sam Harris is possibly the most well-known free will denier. In a debate with Daniel Dennett, he uses two examples to illustrate his opinion. 1a. If Tiger Woods misses a 3-foot putt, it is in a way unreasonable to say that he should have been able to make it, compared to an average golfer, because it is essentially pointless to tell a person of his ability to try harder when he misses a 3-foot putt once out of 1,000 times. Supposedly this suggests some kind of anomaly he was not in control of. This is a rather peculiar, to say the least, understanding of free will. Of course there are a great many factors we are not in control of. I find it rather baffling for someone to suggest that a definition of choice should include the ability to choose when to succeed and when to fail at a particular task. Surely, practically everyone who believes in free will understands it to be the ability to choose to attempt something, such as deciding to try and make a putt. It is obviously necessary to concede that there are numerous variables describing the universe we occupy, none of which we are in absolute command of. Before you even make it to the golf course, you have to decide to play golf. While it is fairly certain that you will succeed in ending up with a club in your hand sometime later, the chance is not 100%. You could have a heart attack and end up in the hospital, or there might be an emergency you have to leave for, overriding your decision to play golf that particular day. Even when you decide to swing the club, you might have a muscle spasm and drop hit. Even when everything is going perfectly until the very last second before the club strikes the ball, a gust of wind could move it an inch and cause you to miss. Demanding that all of these extrinsic factors be under your control is like saying that because you're not free to choose to teleport, you're not truly free to choose. 1b. Harris further argues that since all of our actions are calculated and controlled by the brain, which is a chemical biological system subject to deterministic physical laws, everything that influences the brain, like a slight temperature change in the brain which affects the speed at which a chemical reaction occurs or the chirp of a bird whose sound is processed, ultimately influences the outcome in a progressive chain of events while conscious choice never enters into the process. Like a schizophrenic patient who is genuinely forced to behave in a certain fashion because of a brain tumor, it is effectively tumors all the way down for all of us. This seems to me to be confused on a number of levels. In the material universe, all macroscopic structures exhibit holistic epiphenomena. Do flour, sugar and cream possess intrinsic cake properties, which are there even when they are not used as ingredients for a cake? Of course not. But combining the ingredients in an appropriate manner will produce a compound which in some ethereal sense is more than the sum of its parts. Eating a cake is clearly different from eating the ingredients separately, or even just mixing them in the wrong order. Sure, blending everything together with no regard for a recipe and baking it into a block is different from following proper instructions, but that's exactly the point. The proper process adds something by turning hydrogen, carbon and oxygen atoms into a tasty cake, an outcome you would never have expected if you were merely studying atoms themselves and had never heard of macroscopic properties. Or consider simply color. Red is not an intrinsic property of, say, iron oxide molecules. Individual molecules are too small to reflect light, and even macroscopic structures which appear in a certain color to us only do so if they are illuminated by light of the appropriate wavelength. Since a surface appears red only when it reflects red light, if you shine blue light on an object which supposedly is red, it will not appear red. Thus, color is not a property of the atoms which constitute the universe, and yet everything we see seems to possess the property of color. Considering this, epiphenomena of the brain, a purely physical system, like free will or consciousness, should be no more irritating or unbelievable than colors or cakes. The brain's functionality only appears to be mysterious because we don't understand it sufficiently, yet. There is no need to jump to assuming supernatural capacities to explain its features, or deny them altogether for that matter. A further problem lies in the confusion of lawfulness, determinism and predictability, leading to the implicit assertion that free will, that is to be truly free, is incompatible with determinism on principle alone. This is however quite unreasonable. For the universe to function in any coherent manner, that is to produce a causally consistent history rather than randomly switching between completely chaotic states, it needs to obey some underlying principles, that is to be lawful. If there were no natural laws, positing life could even exist in such a universe, choices would be entirely meaningless, or rather, without the influence of outside impressions which can be deliberated to arrive at a decision, actions would not be choices in any meaningful sense of the word. In fact, such a state of affairs would be incoherent and impossible to sustain. You would not be happy unless you chose to, you would not be sad unless you chose to, and you would not be able to fall in love unless you specifically chose to, and all the while you wouldn't really be choosing per se. Rather, since there is nothing to ponder, you would be forced to pick your affective states randomly, which would then give you impressions upon which you can build further decisions, since a sense of time and the ability to form memories are fundamental for consciousness in the first place. Hence it's an unreasonable criterion for a sensible definition of free will. 2. In another example, Harris claims that it should be clear that if you went back in time, you could not choose differently. Again, this is either a confusion or a misrepresentation. To be sure, if you literally rewound the entire universe to a previous state, including your brain states, it would be unreasonable to assume you could choose differently, because you know nothing of the future and there is no reason for anything to unfold in any other way than it previously did. This is however not the way people use the saying in common parlance. Rather, it implies the benefit of hindsight which you could use to make a different decision, and if you had such, the situation would obviously be different. What the hard determinist really means to say, though, is that, if you rewound the universe to the very beginning and let it run its course, everything would turn out exactly the same way, down to the very thought you have at this very moment. This view is however simply factually incorrect. It has been established beyond any reasonable doubt that we are living in a quantum universe. This means that in the moment of the Big Bang and shortly thereafter, when the universe was smaller than one Planck volume, everything was completely undetermined, so the exact parameters with which it starts off are entirely random. Moreover, quantum effects continued to influence the universe's development all throughout. Early on, these effects were substantial enough to alter its macroscopic history significantly, but even today there is a small, yet non-zero, chance that Tiger Woods explodes the moment he swings the club. Therefore, our universe is very much lawful. Macroscopic objects obey Newtonian mechanics, among other laws, and even quantum mechanics is lawful even though the outcomes are probabilistic, but it is not deterministic. Another noteworthy distinction is to be made between determinism and predictability. Even if the universe was truly deterministic, it would be fundamentally unpredictable. Of course we could, and can, make probabilistic approximations about future states of the system, but analytical, exact, solutions are physically impossible to obtain. Today, apparently simple systems like the stability of the solar system are impossible to predict more accurately than to within a few 100 million years. It has been shown that measuring the position of Earth with an error of merely 15 meters would make its position unpredictable after more than 100 million years. It should go without saying that the human brain with billions of neurons and chemical reactions is beyond all hope of being calculated analytically. Note that probabilistic simulation, which is very likely possible and the goal of whole brain emulation research, is aimed at creating a representative simulation of the human brain on a different, inorganic, substrate, which responds in essentially the same way the organic brain does, a fundamentally different process from calculating the position and movement of every atom in the brain. This means that no matter how accurate your models are and no matter how powerful your computer is to calculate the model, beyond a certain limit predictions become physically impossible to obtain because the required measurement accuracy would become infinitely small, or conversely the required energy would exceed the entire universe's. So even a deterministic universe can only really be considered deterministic on sufficiently small energy and timescales. It might produce the same outcome every time you rewind and run it again, but unless you already know the outcome, it is effectively unpredictable. I will refrain from a lengthy discussion of realism versus anti-realism at this point because this part is only tangentially related to the discussion about free will. But since determinism is so often misrepresented, it seems appropriate to mention. Just like, as I said before, the absence of certain properties in constituent parts does not preclude the emergence of holistic phenomena. Determinism, even if it were an accurate description of our universe, would not automatically render genuinely free choice actions impossible merely because it seems a property of its basic parts should contradict such. Consequently, free will, just like consciousness, is a gradient. It makes no sense to ask where the effect is suddenly switched on when scaling up from the microscopic components to the macroscopic system. The brain, just like any other machine, can be in perfect working condition, or working poorly, or be completely broken. So if someone, in a momentary lapse of judgment, yells an insult even though he didn't really mean to, this is not, necessarily, because it was physically impossible for him to act otherwise, rather than simply due to a lack in self-control. To illustrate this position, I'd like to propose a thought experiment. Suppose you take a quantum die, the bane of Schrödinger's cat. This is not some impossible, hypothetical device. You can build one very easily with a Geiger counter and a bit of radioactive material. At the beginning of the experiment, the subject chooses two possible dishes for breakfast, like eggs and bacon. She then commits herself to consulting the die every morning and eating either eggs or bacon, only one or the other, whichever the result demands. After gathering a sufficiently large number of data points, perhaps a year or a decade, you rewind the entire universe to the exact moment the subject chose to take part in the experiment, such that the position of every single particle is exactly the way it was before, obviously leaving her unaware of anything having happened. Then you run the experiment again, for as many times as you like. Since the subject, along with the entire universe, is supposedly predetermined, lacking free will, she should not be able to obey the rules of the experiment. To begin with, even during the first iteration, it would become increasingly unlikely for her predetermined nature to align perfectly with the random results of the quantum die. One might argue that she was predetermined to do whatever the die demands, and even though including random events in a deterministic history seems rather contradictory, this is not the real issue. Rather, because the quantum die is fundamentally indeterministic, decoupled from the chain of causality, and will produce differing sequences every time. During consecutive iterations of the experiment, the subject will encounter situations in which she is forced to choose a different dish than the time before. In a deterministic universe, her decisions would be predetermined long before she ever knew about the experiment and, supposedly, incidentally align with the random die rolls against all odds. Even if we assume she was predetermined to obey the die rolls no matter what they turned out to be, this can only account for the very first iteration. Since the universe is exactly the same at the beginning of every attempt, including the internal states of the die, and the future, indeterministic, results of the die can't change the state of the universe backwards in time to enable her to react to the result, the subject would sooner or later be in the position where it is physically impossible for her to choose to eat what she is supposed to, and, Since this would happen many times, on average every other day, it would become increasingly apparent to her that something is fundamentally wrong with her. The first time, it might be written off as an emotional fluke, but after a while it should become jarring. She would not be able to attribute this to a lack of strength of will or experience the choice like giving into a craving for the wrong food, because the die's result will contradict her emotions only at random times. Given our experience of the world and knowledge of the laws of nature, it is highly implausible to suggest that, were the universe to be rewound, we would suddenly lose our sense of being able to choose freely, and it is contradictory to claim the universe would somehow lose its presumed determinacy. It needs to be emphasized that even though the experiment would not work with a regular, deterministic die, since it would produce the same rolls every iteration, quantum indeterminism neither principally enables nor significantly influences the ability to choose. That capacity doesn't just disappear if you don't choose a quantum die to factor into a decision-making process. The brain, despite its fantastic, mysterious marvelousness, is simply a machine which is complex enough and structured in an appropriate way to be able to produce all the phenomena we experience.